So it's daunting, even for parents who are shrinks. I know that my kids are going to grow up. But when I look at photos of my kids, it's very hard for me to imagine that they ever were not my little kids. Something happens in our culture that makes it hard for girls when they tend to become more like teenagers earlier than their peers. They get singled out. Whereas the guys become like the alpha males, the girls actually have a harder time. There are two aspects of the brain in particular that help us to understand why teens sometimes do things that they probably shouldn't have done. These insulating sheets allow the signal to travel most efficiently. The brain myelinates from the bottom up. So the primitive regions of the brain, the fight or flight regions, the regions that get stirred up, they're much more efficient at transmitting information early on than is the frontal lobe, the region of the brain that helps you to make good decisions. So there's something about being a teenager that doesn't allow for the brain to respond in a kind of controlled way. The brain will go haywire much quicker. So hot cognitions, actually it's a term in the cognitive neuroscience literature. It's when teens basically, and this happens to adults too, but we see it more often in adolescents, get stirred up. So the hotter the cognition, the less opportunity there is for this frontal lobe to talk, to say, stop, slow down. We have to think about the strengths and relative weaknesses of the kids. That's super important. If the kid's never been good at math, they're not going to suddenly be good at math. And it's not fair to ask that of them. Instead, we would like to try to figure out how to support them in those relative weaknesses and then play to their strengths. We have to think about what their pre-existing cognitive abilities are. It's what you do with what you have that really matters, and getting that message across to kids, that's super important and also lowers their anxiety some. We need some anxiety. Here they're expressing anxiety as the word arousal. We need to be aroused somewhat to learn something, to take on new information. But if we get too aroused, then that curve starts to drip back down and we actually do worse. Given that there's no shrinks around, or there's very few, what are you supposed to do? And there's a lot of data out there about how communities can look after themselves. The first one is something I already talked about. Don't yell. You have to make yourself talk quietly when your kid is worked up. It won't always work, but it's a good starting place. It's a good starting place to decrease the stress. Being outside is actually measurably therapeutic. It also increases something called brain-derived neurotrophic growth factor. It literally builds connections in the brain that weren't there before. Now the problem with giving this as a prescription to people is when you're anxious or depressed, you actually don't feel like exercising. You don't have to go run 5 miles. You could go walk the dog around the block a couple times. If you can just get them to do things like that, not just because they're getting out of the house, but because they're moving and because they're outside. What happens with, instead of not just embracing each other, but embracing both the diversity as well as the similarities that we share with each other, you actually decrease the cortisol response to stress, especially when you encounter other moments where you think there might be biases against you. There's a lot of wisdom that we can share with each other. And if we can find a way to sort of talk more openly about that, look after each other, I know this sounds very kumbaya-ish, if we can find a way to do that, actually societies get safer. That kind of ability to watch each other is protective, is neuroprotective, it's actually life-saving.